Shri Srimad ISKCON Prabhupada save the whole world, Srila Prabhupada ki. Jai Nitya Vishnu Vishnu Pad Paramahamsa. Hariva Jakacharya. Asto Tarasati Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur ki. Ananta Koti Vaishnavindra ki. Namacharya Shravagasta ki. Remzi Kamala Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Sitari Gaur Bhakti ki. Shri Radha Krishna Gopal Shama Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhana ki. Braj Gomichir Dhamma ki. Navadip Mayapur Dhamma ki. Purushottam Kshetra Jagannath Puri Dhamma ki. Ganga Mai ki. Jamuna Mai ki. Bhakti Devi ki. Nasi Maharani ki. Samaveta Bhakti ki. Jainita Goprevarandi. All glories to some of the Lords. All glories to some of the Lords. All glories to some of the Lords. All glories, Lord, to the Sri Guru and Sri Guru. All glories to Srila Prabhupada ki. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
So as you all know, Gorpanim is fast approaching. And Gorpanim is quite a significant event for us. And actually, I was having a conversation with someone the other day, I can't remember who it was, and they were discussing the importance of Caitanya Caritamrita. And they related a story to me, that this is a story from Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Was you told me the story, Shastra? I don't remember. But anyhow, so the story goes like Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he was explaining that, like, if you're in a flood, you had three books, right? You had the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Caitanya Caritamrita. If you lost the Bhagavad Gita, it wouldn't be so bad. And then read and explain. And if you lost the Srimad Bhagavatam, it wouldn't be so bad. But if you lost the Caitanya Caritamrita, this would be very bad. So Caitanya Caritamrita is a very, very important book. And one of the reasons it's a very important book is because in this book, we find that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu explains, and Krishnadas Kaviraj explains the whole philosophy of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. Because what happened was when because we look at the Bhagavatam, for instance, it can be quite confusing. Even though the Bhagavatam puts so much emphasis on the Bhagavatam, without clear guidance from an Acharya, for instance, then the Bhagavatam can be quite confusing. And especially when you get towards the end, it kind of makes the point that well, actually, you take shelter with your personal, this is okay, this is actually the best thing. So Sukadeva Goswami throws a bit of a curveball just to sort of confuse people. Just so because Bhagavatam is a very confidential literature. And also it's talking about, especially the 10th canto, very confidential topics. But of course these same confidential topics are described here in the Caitanya Caritamrita, but with the explanation of Lord Chaitanya and also the explanation of Krishnadas Kaviraj. It gives a lot of clarity so we can understand. And this book was written in conjunction, it came from the diaries of Sri Damodar Goswami, also some of the information from Lord Chaitanya's secretary and things like that. So it's quite an interesting text. And it begins with the, another bit of information, is that right now, every year actually, the BBT has 3 separate campaigns. So they have one campaign which is around December, focusing on Gita Jayanti, which is obviously part of the Christmas marathon, book marathon. And so they're promoting the distribution of Bhagavad Gitas. Then there's another one, Bhadra Purnim. This is something that started a few years ago, around Bhadra Purnim, that they're promoting the distribution of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And now with Gaur Purnim, the focus obviously is the Caitanya Charitamrita. But they're not trying to sell the Caitanya Charitamrita, they're trying to encourage us to read the Caitanya Charitamrita, because this is a really important literature. And sometimes we don't spend enough time reading it. Of course, in order to understand the Caitanya Charitamrita, it is quite important to have first gone through the Gita and the Bhagavatam and have digested that to some degree. As we understand Prabhupada, he said that the Gita is preliminary study, the Bhagavatam is the graduate study, and the Caitanya Charitamrita is the postgraduate study. So it's good to have a founding in the philosophy before reading the Caitanya Charitamrita. And in the Caitanya Charitamrita, it starts off very interesting. The first 14 verses are like a Mangalacharna. Mangalacharna means like an auspicious invocation. And so the first 14 verses are considered to be the Mangalacharna for the text. And we see verses 1 to 6 essentially are glorifying Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. First off, we start off with this, verse 3 is on the board. We start off with a really wonderful verse, Vande Gurun Isha Bhaktam Isham. Actually, what I'll do is I'll read this verse, and then we'll go through this verse, and then I'll discuss this. Yad Advaitam Brahmopanishadi Tag Api Asha Tanubha Yadadvaitam Brahmopanishadi Tarapyasha Tanubha Yadadvaitam Brahmopanishadi Tarapyasha Tanubha. And of course, if anyone knows a nicer meter, then you're welcome to chant. Ya Atmantaryami Purusha Iti So Ashyamsa Vibhava Ya Atmantaryami Purusha Iti So Shamsa Vibhava Ya Atmantaryami Purusha Iti Sosyam Savibhava Ya Advaitam Brahmopanishadi Tarapyasya Tanubha Ya Atmantaryami Purusha Iti Sosyam Savibhava Sadaishvarayai Purno Ya Iha Bhagavan Sa Swayam Ayam Sadaishvaraya Purno Ya Iha Bhagavan Sa Swayam Ayam Sadaishvaraya Purno Ya Iha Bhagavan Sa Swayam Ayam Na Chaitanyat Krishnaj Jagati Para Tattvam Param Iha Na Chaitanyat Krishnaj Jagati Param Tattvam Param Iha Na Chaitanyat Krishnaj Jagati Na Chaitanyat Krishna Jagati Paratattvam Paramiha Na Chaitanyat Krishna Jagati Paratattvam Paramiha Yat That which Advaitam Non-dual Brahma Impersonal Brahman Upanishadi Upanishads.
in the Upanishads.
Tat, that.
That
Api,
Api,
certainly.
certainly.
Asya,
Asya,
his.
his.
Tanubha,
Tanuha,
the effulgence of his transcendental body.
the fullness of transcendental body.
Ya,
Ya,
who?
who?
Atma,
Atma,
the supersoul.
the super soul.
Antayami,
Antayami,
indwelling Lord.
indwelling Lord.
Purusha,
Purusha,
supreme enjoyer.
supreme enjoyer.
Iti,
Iti,
thus.
thus.
Sa,
Sa,
he.
he.
Asya,
Asya,
his.
his.
Angsa vibhava,
Savibhava,
plenary expansion.
plenary expansion.
Sat Aishvaryai,
Saishwarya,
with all 6 opulences.
with all 6 opulences.
Does anyone know the 6 opulences?
Beauty, fame, wealth, richness, renunciation,
What else?
fame,
Strength. Krishna's, no one's stronger than Krishna. Yeah? It's actually quite incredible how strong Krishna is. Even with his little pinky, he can lift a massive big mountain, and hold it above his head for 7 days like it's nothing. Prabhupada describes it like it's like a frog's umbrella. You know what a frog's umbrella is? A toadstool. Mushroom. Because the frog, when it's raining, the frog hides under the mushroom. Yeah? So he calls it just like a child holding a frog's umbrella for 7 days above his head. Purna, full. Ya, who? Iha, here. Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
the Supreme Personality of God.
Sa,
Sa,
he.
he.
Swayam,
Swayam,
himself.
himself.
I am
Am,
this.
this.
Na,
Na,
not.
not.
Chaitanya,
Chaitanya,
then Lord Chaitanya.
Lord Chaitanya.
Krishnat,
Krishna,
then Lord Krishna.
Lord Krishna.
Jagati,
Jagati,
in the world.
in the world.
Para,
Para,
higher. Tattvam,
Tattvam,
truth.
truth.
Param,
Param,
another.
another.
Iha,
Iha,
here.
here.
So you see, like there's many phrases here. You'll see that Prabhupada repeatedly quotes throughout his writings, and one in particular that sticks out here is Sad Aishvarya Puna. He mentions that quite a lot. Translation: what the Upanishads describe as the impersonal Brahman is but the effulgence of his body, and the Lord known as the Supersoul is but his localized plenary portion. He is the Supreme Personality of God himself, full with 6 opulences. He is the absolute truth, and no other truth is greater than or equal to him. Responsibly, what the Upanishads describe as the impersonal Brahman is but the effulgence of his body, and the Lord known as the Supersoul
And the Lord known as Super Soul
is but his localized plenary portion.
is his localized plenary portion.
He is the Supreme Personality of Godhead,
He is the Supreme Personality of God,
full with 6 opulences.
full with 6 opulences.
He is the absolute truth,
He is the absolute truth,
and no other truth is greater than or equal to him.
and no other truth is greater than or equal to him.
So this phrase Sad Aishvarya Purna is important because we see that if you look at there's no purport to any of these verses actually, these 14 verses. If you look at different expansions of the Lord, particularly the partial expansions, that they have limited opulences. They may have like we see that Parashuram, for instance, he had the ability to kill, so he was a great warrior. And you look at different a few weeks ago it was the appearance day of Brahma. So he had this strength that he could lift up the earth on his tusk, and he's also fighting ability. So we see like the different plenary portions, they'll have different capacities. But it's declaring here, it says Sad Aishvarya Purna. Lord Chaitanya is Sad Aishvarya Purna. So it means Sad means 6, Aishvarya means opulence, Purna means full. So he has all the opulences fully. So it's indicating that he is Swayam Bhagavan. So very, very interesting verses. I'll just read the first few, actually, this, as I mentioned, there's 14 verses here, which are functioning, actually it goes up to about verse 20. You start off with the first 14 verses. The first 6 verses glorify Lord Chaitanya. They're focusing on glorify Lord Chaitanya. The next 5 verses glorify Lord Nityananda. Then 2 verses glorifying Advaita Acharya, which takes us up to 13. And the 14th verse talks about the Panchatattva, glorifies the Panchatattva. Not glorifies, just mentions the Panchatattva and talks about the 5 features. And then you'll see the following 3 verses. The 15th verse is Jaitam Sutta Pango, this well-known verse about glorifying which deity? Jaitam Sutta Pango, Mama Masabashita Radha Madhana Mohan, Shri Radha Madhana Mohan, which is the deity of Sambandha. Yeah? Very important. Deity of Sambandha. Then the next verse is Divya Brindaram Nikalpa Brahman Srimad Bhagavatam which is glorifying Radha Govinda. Radha Govinda is the deity of Abhideya, the process. Yeah? And actually, at one point Prabhupada explained that all the deities in ISKCON are actually in this Abhideya. They're actually manifestations of Govinda Deva. Another place he said they're all expanded from Radha. But so different times he said different things. But essentially, because the process of deity worship is Abhideya, then the deities we're worshipping ultimately, even though we may call them Radha Govardhana or whatever, ultimately it's Radha Govinda because it's this move of Abhideya. And then the 15th, 16th, 17th verse is Srimad Rasadacharam Be Bhakti Bhattitahasta Kasham Vedasanai Gopi Gopinath Shriyasta. It is glorifying which deity? Radha Gopinath, and he is the deity of Prayojan, gold. The Srimad Rasa, this is talking about the Rasa dance and how Gopinath is engaged with the gopis in the Rasa dance. So this is the Prayojana of seems of our Sampradaya, because this verse is being mentioned here, to be engaged with Radha Gopinath in Vrindavan. So yeah, very, very important statements here, setting the scene for the whole publication of the whole book. And so, and you'll find it's quite a standard practice in Vaishnava literature, especially Gaudiya Vaishnava literature, is the author will start with a mantra, start with setting the scene for the book. And so the very first verse is this Bandi Guru Isha Bhaktan Isham Isha Vatahakam Tat Prakashams Tat Chat Shakti Krishna Chaitanya Sanghakam. I offer my respectful obeisance unto the spiritual masters, the devotees of the Lord's incarnation, the plenary portions, his energies, and the primary Lord himself, Lord Sri Krishna Chaitanya. So we see there that this is establishing 6 aspects or features of Lord Chaitanya. This will be described later on. It starts off in verse 23 of this chapter. It talks about these different manifestations. So the spiritual masters, it's kind of interesting that Prabhupada defines this in different ways later on in this chapter. So essentially this is talking about the initiator guru and the instructor guru. And it talks about how the initiator and the instructor are the same, they're equal. But the initiator, he's the one who initiates one into the process, and the instructor is the one who guides us in spiritual life. But then later on we see that Prabhupada equates, Krishnadas Kaviraj equates the initiator spiritual master with Nityananda. So there's a very important comment he's making there. Then talks about the devotees of the Lord, especially this is referring to Srivas Thakur, and all the other prominent devotees of the Lord. Then talks about the Lord's incarnations. This is referring to? Any idea? Advaita Acharya, yeah, very good. We're referring to Advaita Acharya specifically. Then his plenary portions, who's this referring to? No? Definitely not Gadadhar. master. This is the point that Krishna Kaviraj makes. It refers to Nityananda and the initiating spiritual master, which is very, very interesting. His energies, Gadara, Damodar, Jagannatha, persons like that, they're his energies. Because Jagannatha Pandit was actually who? In Krishna Lila? Satyabhama. So very interesting. And then of course the primary Lord himself, Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who's none other than Lord Krishna. Then it talks about a well-known verse, Vande Sri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Horido Horidaya Pushpavandhu Chitrasana, how he's offering respectful obeisance to Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda, who have risen simultaneously on the horizon of West Bengal. Just like, and he uses, and he compares them to the sun and moon. And then later on in the text of this chapter, actually no, the second chapter, he talks about it a bit more. This chapter and the second chapter, he gives the analogy of how the sun, the moon, they're very, the sun and the moon, they give life. Like the sun will give life to the vegetables, etc. Like just like we had the experience of the flood recently, which is raining, practically no sunshine, or not coming through the clouds anyhow. And if you have a look around, you see so many things have died as a result of excessive water and not sufficient sun. But if we have a balance of sun and water, you'll see that everything flourishes. So the sun is essential to life. And the moon, we understand the moon gives flavor. Like the vegetables, they develop their flavor from the moonshine. And so this analogy is given there. And so they give life, but not only life, but they give illumination. We see like just like now it's coming up to a full moon tomorrow, Friday's a full moon. And so right now you can see it's coming up to full moon. So when I was walking home last night from the temple, I didn't need to use a torch. Because like an essential bit of paraphernalia, there's two things I was told when I moved here. There's essential bits of paraphernalia. It's a torch and gum boots. You got to have it when you go to torch so you don't stand on a snake, and gum boots so you don't get wet feet. So, essential paraphernalia. So Lord Chaitanya and Lord Chaitanya, they're giving this illumination so that we can actually see through this darkness of ignorance. And there's an interesting verse. Actually, I can just touch on this verse now. It's really, really nice verse at the start of the second chapter, where it says, I won't read the verse, but the translation. I offer my obeisances to Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu, by whose mercy even an ignorant child can swim across the ocean of conclusive truth, which is full of the crocodiles of various theories. So this verse also is showing how, by the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, by the mercy manifests in the form of instruction, in the form of transcendental knowledge. And by that mercy, we can understand what is the absolute truth. Because we see that there's a nice verse in the Mahabharata, it says, Tako Pratishta Shruti Yoga Nasho Yasha Rishi Yasha Damasha Tapam Nihitam Bhuvayam Mahajani. So it's saying like dry logic is inconclusive, Taka is inconclusive, you can't establish Pratishta, Apratishta, you can't establish truth. And it says, it talks about Taka, the Shruti Yoga, and the Shruta, the Shruta Vedas, many branches. There's over 100,000 books in the Vedas. How are you ever going to read all of those? I mean, we struggle to get through the Bhagavatam. And so you can't establish the truth by trying to understand these many branches of Bhagavatam. And there's Nasha Rishi Yashamatam to be known that a person is known as a rishi when their conclusions differ from another rishi. This is how you understand a rishi. It's not that they've got the same opinion. Oh, he's a rishi because he's got a different view. So how do you understand the truth by that? This is Dharmasha Tapam Nihitam Guhayam. Guha means like a cave. Guhayam means a secret. So the secret of the Dharmasha Tapam, the truth of Dharma, Nihitam Guhayam, is a secret, it's hidden within the heart of Dharmasha Tapam Mahajana Yenikata Sapanta. The path is understood by following these great souls, the ones who actually see the secret, or who see the secret of Dharma. So this point is made here, is that by the mercy of Mahaprabhu we can actually see the absolute truth, and to dissipate the darkness of ignorance that they've appeared. And then this verse that we're discussing today, it's describing what. The first two verses are basically explain, like the rest of this chapter is the purport to these first two verses. Then if we go to chapter 2, that is explaining verse 3. Then chapter 3 is explaining verse 4. Then chapter 4 is explaining verses 5 and 6. And then you'll see that chapter 5, which is entitled The Doors of Nityananda Ram, is just explaining the next 5. And so it's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, explaining chapter 5. And then chapter 6 is explaining the Predicate. So in this verse here, we see how it's talking about how what the Upanishads describe as the impersonal Brahman is the effulgence of Lord Chaitanya's body. And we see there's many wonderful stories describing the form of Lord Chaitanya. And there's a wonderful description in the Madhya Lila about when Lord Chaitanya visited Prakashananda Saraswati in Benares. And we see there how when he arrived, they asked him to come and sit with him, but he sat with the shoes because he felt that he wasn't really, he was out of humility, he was feeling he wasn't qualified to sit there with them. But then when he was sitting there amongst the shoes, he started to manifest this most brilliant effulgence. And they became bewildered by this effulgence. They were very attracted and bewildered by the effulgence. So we see how Lord Chaitanya, he manifests this effulgence. And then there's many stories about, because it mentions how he's the super soul in the heart of all living entities. So you can see sometimes, just like many nice stories, we can see how Lord Chaitanya understood the heart of his devotees. Like once when, was it Sanatana Goswami, I think? He wanted to throw himself from Govardhana Hill to end his life. And so he went to see Lord Chaitanya. He didn't tell him about his plan. But Lord Chaitanya, he chastised him and said, you surrendered your life to me. Therefore, this is not your body. This is my body. So you're trying to kill you, end your life. You're stealing my property. You can't do this. So we see many, many wonderful stories in the scriptures talking about how, or in the Caitanya Charitamrita talking about how he's, demonstrating actually how he's manifested as the super soul. And then we see it's describing here how he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, full of 6 opulences. And just a few points that I just wanted to touch on from chapter 2, because we see at the start, it's talking about, in the first section, it's talking about how, it talks about how he's actually Lord Krishna, manifest in different ways, and then it talks about he's manifested 3 features, quotes that verse from the first canto, Vedanti Tattva Tattvam Yadgaramanam Brahma Meti Paramat Meti Bhagavan Iti Samjite. And then it goes on to explain how he is manifested in these different ways. It doesn't talk so much about pastimes, because what the chapter is doing is establishing how Lord, is actually establishing how Lord Krishna is all these different things and how he is the original personality of Godhead, and that everything else is expanding on him. So it starts by explaining how these 3 features of the impersonal Brahmajyoti, the super soul of the heart, these have also, and the Supreme Personality of God, are ultimately just expansions of Krishna. Then it talks about Narayan, and how Narayan is also a plenary expansion of Krishna. And then from Narayan, these Purusha avatars manifest. But also, it then goes, how from Narayan these features manifest, but then also it goes on to talk about how from the same Narayan, the Purusha avatars manifest. So the Purusha avatars meaning, anyone know the 3 Purusha avatars? Huh? Yeah, Mahavishnu, or what's the name for Mahavishnu? Karadakshay Vishnu, Gavadakshay Vishnu, and Sridakshaya Vishnu. So, Karanadakshay Vishnu is actually the super soul of the universe. Then Garbhadakshay Vishnu is the super soul, an interesting term that's mentioned in the second chapter. He's the super soul of the aggregate living entities, which I thought was a really interesting definition. I'm not claiming to be able to explain that. I'm not really sure how that works. But then we have Chidakshay Vishnu. He's the super soul in the heart of every living entity, of the individual living entities. And we understand that from Karanadakshay Vishnu, he lies down in the Karana ocean. Karana means Sarva Karana Karanam, it describes in the Brahma Samhita, the first verse. What's Karana mean? Causal. It's the cause, the ocean everything comes from. So he's the causal incarnation. He's the incarnation which everything emanates from. So he lies down in the Karana ocean, and the universes come out of the pores of his body. And just reflecting on that, it describes this in detail in the Brahma Samhita. But just reflecting on that for a minute, this universe we're situated in is, anyone know how wide this universe is? 4 billion miles from one side to the other. The radius is 2 billion. The diameter is 4 billion miles. That comes out of one of his pores. So it gives you an idea of, even though it's a seed form, and what happens is as the seed comes out, is the elements, they conglomerate on that form, but still it gives you an idea. He must be pretty big. Yeah? Right, and this is the smallest universe. Our universe is one of the smaller ones. I think it's the smallest. And our Brahma has 4 heads, but there's universes where the Brahmas have millions of heads. So the other universes are substantially bigger. But all these universes are coming out of the pores. And as they come out of the pores, then the elements start to conglomerate on them or gather on them, and they settle down on the Karana ocean, like little golden threads. They cluster together, and they sit down in the ocean. Some are below the water, some are above the water, some are sitting on the water, and then he expands as Garbhadakshay Vishnu and enters into each of these millions and billions and unlimited trillions of universes. It's unlimited. You cannot count them, how many universes are there. And he expands and enters into each one as Garbhadakshay Vishnu. And then what happens is Garbhadakshay Vishnu, he's in the universe, it's dark and it's getting hot. So what happens when you get hot? You start to sweat. Right? And so he sweats. And he fills the universe half with his sweat. But it's not smelly sweat like our sweat. It's transcendental. Yeah? And so he fills the universe half with that sweat. So that gives you an idea of here is Karanadakshay Vishnu, he's expanded in these unlimited incarnations as Garbhadakshay Vishnu. He's not depleted by that. It's not like, if we were to sort of, manifest something like that, it would take us a lot of energy and we feel depleted. And the same is like, like when you sweat a lot, you feel, because you usually sweat from activity, you feel quite exhausted. But Garbhadakshay Vishnu, when he sweats, he doesn't feel like depleted or anything, because the nature of the Lord is he's unlimited. And he manifests all these qualities unlimitedly. So, and then what happens is Garbhadakshay Vishnu expands the universes. Expands all the Brahma comes out. He manifests the creation, the secondary creation. All the living entities come out from Garbhadakshay Vishnu. Then he expands again and enters into all the living entities as the super soul in the heart, the witness. So you see, this is coming from just one feature of Caitanya Mahaprabhu. There's this whole creation is just coming out from him. And then it goes on to talk about the different, so we talk about those, so they've got the Brahman, Brahman and the super soul, and the Lord himself, and we have the Purushavatars. Then it also, and what happens in the second chapter is that Krishna's Kaviraj, he talks about how Brahma was glorifying the Lord, talking about how he's the different Purusha, the different Purusha avatars, and then he establishes Krishna Kaviraj. He establishes that actually Krishna, he's the source of all this. He quotes that verse, that well-known verse from the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto. Ete chansa kalapam sam Krishnas tu bhagavan swayam indrali yakalam lokam vinadiyani yuge. So this verse basically saying is that Krishna is the origin of all. And this verse is Krishna's tu bhagavan swayam. Jiva Goswami defines this as the real essence of the Bhagavatam. He calls it the Paribhasa Sutra. Paribhasa Sutra means a verse by which the work is understood. So he defines it as the essence of the Bhagavatam, and also calls it the Emperor verse. Through this verse you understand the Bhagavatam. There's actually an essay he wrote about, a very, very wonderful essay about this one verse. And yeah, so then Krishna's Kaviraj, using grammar, he defines how this verse is, because some people may say that actually, because if you look at the list of incarnations that's given in the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto, it lists Krishna and Balaram. I think it's 23 and 24, something, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it lists them just down the line. And so some people take that and say, but actually no, this is saying they're expansions of Vishnu. But if like our understanding is Vishnu is just like the mechanism or the portal whereby these different incarnations, they're coming through Shridakshay Vishnu into the universe. But they're not actually expansions of Shridakshay Vishnu. And this verse that Krishna's Kaviraj is quoting, this Ete Chansa Kalapamsa, Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. There's in grammar, there's this, I mean, I'm not very good with grammar, I didn't sort of do well. The only part I did well in English was writing stories. The grammar part I didn't do so well at. But apparently, according to grammar, it's the same in English. You must state the subject before the predicate. So the subject is what's being discussed, the predicate is what's being discussed about the subject, essentially. And so we see in the first line it says ete chansa, so the thing eta is chansa, plenary portion, so it's talking about this, and this is Krishnas, tu Bhagavan Swayam, so Krishnas is the subject, tu Bhagavan, and it's being described, Bhagavan Swayam. He is the original, the supreme personality of God, Bhagavan Swayam. So it's, by grammar he's establishing that Krishna is the original. And then he goes on to say, a very, very nice verse, I think I've written it down here, and he concludes actually with this, I can't remember what verse it is, let me see if I can find it. Towards the end. I guess I should have written a number down, that would have been clever. Really nice verse. It's one of those verses that in my mind is worth learning. No, that's not. Oh, here it is. Verse 109. So this is towards the end of the 2nd chapter. Se Krishna Avatari Rajendra Kumar Apane Caitanya Rupa Kailaya Avatar. That same Lord Krishna. So this whole chapter is just establishing how Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in many different ways, including various shastras. But then in text 109 of the 2nd chapter, he's saying that same Lord Krishna, the fountainhead of all incarnations, because he's established that from this verse from the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto, that Krishna is the fountainhead. All incarnations, they come from him. Is known as the son of the king of Braja. This is Brajendra Kumar. He has descended personally as Lord Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. So this is he's just summarizing this whole verse that's being described there. That actually, that personality, the supreme personality of God, he's come in this age as Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. And that's the essence of this verse, is that Krishna, he has come, he's appeared in this world as Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu to deliver the fallen souls. And I think Mukunda Maharaj is going to be discussing some Chaitanya Charitamrita or some aspect of this tomorrow.
I think it's going to be around the Lila.
Yeah, around Lila, so he's going to talk about Lila. And there's so much more that can be discussed philosophically here, because we see in the subsequent verses, it's going to be talking about the external reasons for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's appearance, the internal reasons for his appearance. There's a few different topics that are discussed there. And as I mentioned, this is basically covering the first 4 chapters of Chaitanya Charitamrita. So there's quite a lot. It's all, it's quite involved philosophy, but it's important for us to understand who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is and why he's appeared. And essentially, he's appeared to give that which no other incarnation of Godhead has come, to give us love of Godhead. Of course, he has his internal reasons. He wants to experience the love of Radha and things like that. But externally, for us, that he's appeared to give us Krishna consciousness, and in the most easily digestible way. Because all you have to do is you have to chant Hare Krishna, study a bit of philosophy, take Krishna Prasad, and go back to Godhead. Whereas previously it was much more difficult. You read some of these yogis who were doing it, very, very difficult. Okay, any comments, questions? Krishna Kirtan? Looks like you're bursting for a question there.
Next, actually, 110 is also very nice verse.
Huh?
2:110 is very nice also.
2:110.
Very
Oh yeah. Where it mentions Ata eva Chaitanya Goshani Paratatva Shingham Tanrik Chiro Dakshayi Kahi Kitana Mahima. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya is the supreme absolute truth. To call him Chiradakshayi Vishnu does not add to his glory. When we think of Chiradakshayi Vishnu, how he's expanded into the heart of every single living entity, that's phenomenal. Could you imagine how powerful a person would have to be to do that, or a being would have to be to enter into everyone's sin? Could you imagine being present in everyone's mind, or just in the minds of all the people in this room? How confusing would that be? It's bad enough being in our own head, but to be in everyone's in this room's head, that'd be like, wow, that'd be your brain, you get scrambled. But he's in everyone's heart. And he's understanding every single thought, desire, aspiration you have. And he's able to deal with it. So how great is that personality? And yet, to call him that doesn't add to his glories. So this is just the way that Krishna Kaviraj is using to show how wonderful, how glorious Lord Chaitanya is. And that's what these first 4 chapters are focusing on. Is the glories of Lord Chaitanya and just how merciful he is, how he's just appeared here just to give us this opportunity to go back up to Godhead. And it doesn't matter, you can reflect on the different personalities. So just look at the farm, for instance. There's so many different personalities here. And I remember talking to a devotee years ago, and he was reflecting on the nature of Krishna consciousness, how wonderful it was, because normally the devotees who are associated with, normally, like if we're living outside, hand taken to the process of ocean source, we wouldn't want to know them because they're just too different from us. But by the process of bhakti, by the mercy of Lord Chaitanya, we've all come here to practice Krishna consciousness together. And this is the glory of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, is that we're able to take this process and relatively peacefully coexist and practice Krishna consciousness together. Even though we have such different outlooks, such different backgrounds, such different likes and dislikes, by the mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we're all able to come together and practice like this. Okay, anything else at all? Krishna Kirtan?
Maybe you could just, even though you've just given a whole class about this subject about how Krishna and Lord Chaitanya exactly the same personality, the same person, but they manifest different forms.
Well, it describes, I think it's Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, it says Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Radha Krishna Narayana. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he's manifested, combined as Radha Krishna. And as I mentioned, there's I think it's chapter 3. I can't remember. It's chapter 3. It talks about the external reasons for his manifestation. Yeah, so discuss the reason for his appearance, and then chapter 4 is the external reasons for his appearance. And there's different explanations given by the acharyas on why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared. Of course, we can understand there's the external aspect where we see that Advaita Acharya, he was performing different types of tapasya, and he was worshipping Tulsi and Shalagram with Ganges water to beg for Lord Chaitanya to appear. But also we see that in this age that there's a lot of confusion about the Yuga Dharma and the religious process, and also we see that people were misusing Vedic texts for other reasons, and just the whole system of Varnashram was a bit messed up. And I was reflecting on this morning how like if you look at different groups, religious groups, they'll see like the Mayavadis, that they'll look at Shankara and see that he came to present this Mayavadi philosophy, or Buddhists will have another perception, or different religions are going to have different perceptions. But the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, they explain like because people had started to use the Vedic texts basically to gratify their senses and to dominate over others, that Lord Chaitanya wanted to bring, or Lord Krishna saw this, and he wanted to restore the balance, restore the proper position of Vedas. So first off, we see that Lord Buddha came, he rejected the Vedic text. He said, no, these are of no use. You just have to practice these certain good acts, good speech, all this sort of stuff. Don't know that philosophy so well. Then we see that after that, following that, then Lord Shiva came as Sankacharya to re-establish the importance of the Vedic texts. But he did it by modifying the Buddhist philosophy just a bit, because the philosophy, like Mayavada philosophy is just a covered form of Buddhism. It's the same philosophy essentially. It's all one. They say zero, and then the Mayavada is saying it's all one. And then from that we see that different acharyas came with Ramanujacharya, who was it? Jamunacharya, Ramanujacharya, then Madhvacharya. And we see that they started to bring these different acharyas came to start to bring it back to the devotional line. And then finally, then Madhvacharya, then Madhavendra Puri. And so Madhavendra Puri, he started to re-establish the teachings of love of Godhead through worshiping Krishna, etc. And the conjugal rasas, the highest ras. And then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, being the disciple of the disciple of Madhavendra Puri, re-established it in its full glory. So essentially, as we see, Krishna is establishing the Gita, how that surrendering unto him, this is the highest goal. But it's a little bit more difficult to do. Whereas Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has established it in a very simplified way. That because Krishna says, abandon all varieties and surrender unto me. He's going to give all this stuff up first. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu doesn't say this. It's just chant Hare Krishna. But it's the same thing, but it's just, because the people in this age, because they're so devoid of quality. And this is pointed out in the beginning of the Bhagavatam, that in this age, when people are so devoid of quality, it's really difficult for them to actually give up all these attachments. It's really difficult for them just to surrender. I mean, from our experience, we know how difficult it is just to surrender to something. Sometimes it takes us years and years and years to convince ourselves just to surrender to a particular aspect of the process of bhakti. Sometimes we do a bit quicker. And we find that as Kali Yuga goes on, people are becoming more like, the proud individual, fiercely independent. You know, they don't want to surrender anyone. But Chaitanya Prabhu is not even asking for this, just chant Hare Krishna. And through this, because the name, as it describes as Nama Chaitanya Krishna's Chaitanya Rasa Vigraha Puristiti Binatram Nama Nama Nama. How the name is actually, it's a transcendental touchstone and it's non-different from Krishna himself. So just by chanting the holy names, one associates directly with Krishna, and this then awakens our love. It removes our anarthas, it awakes our love for Krishna. I'm not sure that I really focused directly on the point, but somewhat around the edge. So that's the point that Lord Chaitanya is really emphasizing, is that by chanting the holy names, because it's not the only thing he presented, but it's the main thing he presented. It's the Yuga Dharma, and it's the main panacea for people in this age who are bewildered and frustrated and just tormented by what's going on. I mean, all you have to do is just look at the last 2 years, the last 3 years, what's been going on in the world. And people are really experiencing a lot of difficulty. And we find that, you'll hear how the services of counsellors and, psychiatrists and stuff they're stretched to the limit these days because people just don't know how to deal with what's going on in the world. You have the bushfires, and then the pandemic, and then the war in Ukraine, and the floods, and it just goes on and on. This is the material world. Prabhupada would often say, don't be surprised. Why are you surprised when there's a pandemic? Why are you surprised when there's a flood? And Prabhupada saying, don't be surprised because this is the nature of this world and it's just going to increase. And trying to understand it, trying to understand this situation just by our own intellect, just by our own experience, it's not possible. It's only when one takes the process of Krishna consciousness you can actually understand the reality of this world, and you can understand the reality of who we are and our connection with God. And that then enables us to be able to process it and to understand what's going on and realize it's all temporary. Just like with the flood, the water comes up, the water goes down. Next year you won't even notice it. Except if you go down to the pole in the park on the other side of the river there, you'll see 2022 flood marked up there. That's the only recollection you have of it is it's on the pole. I was looking at the other day and thinking they have to make that pole taller. But that's the nature of everything in this material world. It comes and goes. And there's practically whatever you do in this material world, it's just like when you walk along, you see this when you walk along the beach, right, just above where the water's coming in. You walk along the beach and you look back and you'll see you'll see your footprints, and then the water comes and gone. And that's what it'll be like for us, 20, 50, 100 years after we die. You'll just be a name on a piece of paper somewhere, or maybe you'll even get a plaque on a wall or something like that. But you're just gonna be, that's all that people remember about you is your name. And then 200 years, 300 years down the track, they'll even remember that. And that's the material world. It comes and goes. So just tolerate it. And this is the point that Krishna makes to Arjuna in the Gita. Learn to tolerate these things without being disturbed. But only through Krishna consciousness will you be able to tolerate it. Because otherwise you just can't understand why it's happening. Why fires? Why floods? It's like they're going to argue with global warming. No, there's no such thing as global warming. It's all, backwards and forwards. They'll argue and argue till the end of time. And no one will ever come to a conclusion. But by taking the practice of Krishna consciousness, you'll understand why this is happening. You'll understand plainly why this is happening. That's why Chaitanya Prabhu, his message is so important. And it's so easy to understand if you just apply yourself to the process of Krishna consciousness. And it's so important for us in this age. Okay, thank you very much for Prabhupada ki, Sarveta Bhaktivinoda ki, Jai Jai Bhaktivinoda.